Jack Thorne was a man who believed that the only things worth having were the things you bled for. He had spent the first half of his life looking down the barrel of a Colt Navy revolver, a notorious gunslinger whose name was whispered in saloons from Tucson to Deadwood. He had buried that life, along with his guns, beneath the frozen soil of the Wyoming Territory, trading lead for land. Now, he ran the Iron Ridge Ranch, a sprawling empire of 3,000 acres that he ruled with the same cold, calculated precision he had once used to clear a street of outlaws. It was the dead of winter, late October 1883, and the Wyoming wind didn't just blow, it screamed. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, blanketing the plains in a suffocating layer of white that hid the horizons. The temperature had dropped low enough to freeze water in a canteen within minutes. To Thorne, the brutal weather was just another adversary to be outlasted. He believed in grit. He believed that if you worked hard, kept your head down, and made smart decisions, you survived. If you didn't, you perished. It was a philosophy forged in gun smoke, and he applied it to every soul who worked his land. He employed over 40 hands to manage 2,000 head of cattle. His reputation in the nearby town of Oak Haven was one of absolute authority. Jack Thorne didn't tolerate laziness, didn't hand out charity, and didn't ask questions about a man's past, mostly because he didn't want anyone asking about his. His business was keeping the ranch profitable. What his workers did after the dinner bell rang was their own affair. That distance, that wall he built between himself and the people who served him, had served him well. Until the night the snowstorm revealed a crack in his armor. Thorne was in his study, a small, austere room attached to the main house where he kept his ledgers and a bottle of rye whiskey. The rest of the ranch had gone silent. The hands were packed into the bunkhouse, the horses were stalled, and the only sound was the house groaning under the weight of the wind. Thorne stood up, his joints popping. He walked to the window to latch the shutter against the gale when a shadow caught his eye. Movement near the barn. Thorne's eyes narrowed. Instincts honed by years of gunfights flared to life. The barn was locked. The livestock was secured. No one had business out there in a blizzard. He watched as a small figure slipped through the side door, barely visible against the driving snow. His jaw tightened. Rustlers were bold, but rarely stupid enough to strike in weather like this. Still, old habits died hard. Thorne grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat and the gun belt he hadn't worn in years, buckling it around his waist with muscle memory that felt dangerously familiar. He stepped out into the biting cold, the wind instantly stinging his face. His boots crunched heavily on the frozen ground as he moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man who used to hunt men for a living. He kept his hand near the revolver, approaching the barn from the blind side. He wasn't moving like a rancher, he was moving like a killer. He eased the barn door open, just a crack, prepared to draw. But the sight that greeted him froze his hand in place. It wasn't a thief. It was My Lin, his cook. My Lin had been with the Iron Ridge for 6 months. She was a ghost of a woman, quiet, efficient, head always bowed. She cooked meals that were far better than the slop most ranches served, kept the kitchen spotless, and never spoke unless spoken to. Thorne paid her well, better than most in the territory paid Chinese immigrants, and he assumed she went home to a room in town every night. She was kneeling in the corner of the barn, in a horse stall that had been hastily cleared of manure but still smelled of damp hay and animals. The only light came from a sputtering lantern. And she wasn't alone. Huddled next to her, buried under a pile of scratchy horse blankets and straw, were 2 children. Twins, a boy and a girl, no older than 6. They had the same dark hair and almond eyes as their mother, their small faces pinched with a cold that went bone deep. The boy was shivering violently, clutching a piece of wood carved to look like a dog. The girl was staring at the lantern flame as if willing it to be warmer. Thorne watched, unseen in the shadows, as My Lin reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out 2 cold biscuits, leftovers from the dinner she had served the ranch hands hours ago. She broke them carefully, handing the larger pieces to the children. "Eat," she whispered, her voice trembling not from cold, but from fear. "Slowly. Make it fill you." Thorne felt a strange sensation in his chest, a tightness he usually associated with a bad hand at poker or a bullet grazing his ribs. She wasn't stealing silver or tools. She was stealing warmth. She was surviving, displaying the very grit he claimed to worship, yet she was doing it in the dirt of his own barn while he sat by a fire 50 yards away. He watched as she tucked the blankets tighter around the children. The little girl, Leanne, whispered something Thorne couldn't catch. Mylin shook her head, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and kissed the girl's forehead. The boy, Jun, curled into his mother's side. Mylin didn't lie down. She sat with her back against the rough wood of the stall, keeping watch, her eyes heavy with an exhaustion that looked fatal. Thorne stepped back, letting the door close silently. He stood in the snow, the wind howling around him, but he didn't feel the cold anymore. He felt a burning shame. He had prided himself on knowing everything that happened on his land. He could spot a limping calf from a mile away. He could tell when a fence post was rotting. But he hadn't seen this. He returned to the main house, but he didn't sleep. He sat in his leather chair, staring at the unlit fireplace. He realized he knew nothing about Mylin. He knew her name, he knew she could cook, and he knew she was Chinese. In the West, that last fact usually meant she was invisible to men like him. He had treated her like a piece of machinery, essential, but interchangeable. By the time the grey light of dawn began to bleed through the storm clouds, Thorne had a plan. He wasn't a man who operated on pity, he operated on facts. He needed to understand how a woman on his payroll ended up destitute. The ranch came alive with the sunrise. Thorne watched from the kitchen window. Mylin was already at the stove, frying bacon and brewing coffee. She looked immaculate, her hair pulled back tight, her apron clean. If he hadn't seen her in the barn, he would never have known she had spent the night freezing in straw. He walked into the kitchen. The heat of the stove hit him, contrasting sharply with the memory of the barn. "Morning, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady, eyes fixed on the skillet. "Mylin," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave lower than usual. "Leave the bacon. We need to talk." She froze. The spatula trembled in her hand. Did I burn something, sir? I can start over." "It's not about the food," Thorne stepped closer. "It's about where you sleep." The color drained from her face. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with terror. In her world, discovery didn't mean help, it meant eviction. It meant being cast out into the snow. "Mr. Thorne, please," she whispered. "I won't let it happen again. I'll find a place. Please don't fire me. My children." "Stop," Thorne said. He didn't shout, but the command was absolute. "I'm not firing you. But I am going to town. And when I get back, we're going to fix this." He turned and walked out before she could respond. He found his foreman, Boone, by the corral. Boone was a grizzly of a man, loyal as a dog but rough around the edges. "Boone," Thorne said, pulling on his riding gloves. "How long have you known?" Boone blinked, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Known what, boss?" "That the cook is living in the horse stall with 2 kids." Boone winced. He took off his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. "About 3 months. Caught her sneaking in one night in September. She begged me not to tell you. Said she was afraid you'd think she was bringing trouble to the ranch. You know how folks are about her kind. And you let her stay there? In winter." Thorne's voice was like grinding stones. "She's stubborn, Jack. And she's terrified. She said she's saving every penny to pay off some debt. I figured as long as she did her work, it wasn't my place to pry." "It is your place," Thorne snapped. "If it happens on my land, it's my business. Saddle my horse. I'm going to Oak Haven." The ride to town was brutal, the wind cutting through Thorne's coat, but his anger kept him warm. Oak Haven was a collection of wooden buildings clinging to the edge of civilization. Thorne rode straight to the general store. Mrs. Gable, The proprietor looked up as Thorne stomped the snow off his boots. "Mr. Thorne. Terrible weather for a ride." "I need information, Martha," Thorne said, leaning his hands on the counter. "My Lynn. My cook. What do you know about her?" Mrs. Gable's face softened into a look of tragic knowing. "Oh, that poor creature. I assume you found out." "Found out what?" "About her husband. Chen. He worked the mines up at Silver Peak. Died in a collapse last year. The company claimed it was user error, of course. Didn't pay a dime. But Chen had taken out loans to pay for passage for his wife's parents, who died on the journey anyway. When he died, the debt fell to my Lynn." "How much debt?" Thorne asked. "To the mining company? And the local lender, Silas Vane? Last I heard, with the interest rates they charge immigrants. Near $400. Thorne's knuckles turned white. $400 was a fortune. A cowboy made $30 a month if he was lucky. She was drowning, and the sharks were circling. "She's been paying it," Mrs. Gable whispered. "Every cent she earns. She buys almost no food for herself. Just enough for the little ones." Thorne left the store and went to the doctor's office next. Doc Holloway confirmed the rest. One of the twins, the boy, had been sick with pneumonia in the fall. The treatment had cost her the last of her savings. "She sold her wedding ring to pay me," Holloway said, cleaning his spectacles. "I told her I could wait for the money, but she has pride, Jack. Too much of it." Thorne walked back to his horse. He looked at the town, the bank, the saloon, the respectable facades hiding a rot of exploitation. He had spent his life thinking the world was divided into the strong and the weak. He realized now that for people like my Lynn, the game was rigged. It didn't matter how hard she worked, the house always won. Unless someone burned the house down. Or bought it. Thorne rode back to the ranch with a dark determination. When he arrived, the sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. He didn't go to his office. He went straight to the barn. My Lynn was there, frantically trying to pack her meager belongings into a burlap sack. The twins were sitting on the straw, looking confused and frightened. When Thorne threw the door open, My Lynn flinched as if he'd struck her. "Leave the bag," Thorne said. "We are going, Mr. Thorne," she stammered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "We will find a place. We won't bother you." "I said leave it." Thorne walked over, looming over her. She cowered, shielding her children. Thorne knelt down, bringing his face level with hers. For the first time, she saw that his eyes weren't angry. They were tired. "You aren't going anywhere," Thorne said quietly. "Not out there. You'll freeze before you hit the main road. But pack only what you need for tonight. You're sleeping in the main house. The guest room is made up. It has a fireplace. It has beds." My Lynn stared at him, her mouth opening and closing. "Mr. Thorne. I cannot. I am the cook. It is not right. People will talk." "Let them talk," Thorne growled. "If anyone has a problem with it, they can take it up with me. And from what I recall, nobody in this territory is stupid enough to do that." He looked at the boy, Jun, who was still clutching the wooden dog. Thorne reached out, and the boy flinched. Thorne paused, then gently tapped the wooden toy. "Good carving. Did you make that?" The boy nodded slowly. "You got steady hands," Thorne said. He stood up. "Move. Now. Before the temperature drops again." He ushered them across the yard, shielding them from the wind with his own body. He brought them into the main house, a place no worker had ever been invited to stay. He showed them to the guest room, lit the fire himself, and watched as the warmth began to return to their faces. "Tomorrow," Thorne said, standing in the doorway, "we change the arrangement. No more barn. No more debt." My Lynn looked at him, clutching her daughter's hand. Why? She asked. Why do this? Thorne adjusted his gun belt. Because I thought I was running a ranch. Turns out I was running a plantation. And I don't like being wrong. The next morning, the Iron Ridge Ranch underwent a seismic shift. Thorne didn't just move My Lin, he went to war with his own books. He called Boone into his office at dawn. I want a full audit, Thorne said, pouring coffee. I want to know who owes money, who's sick, and who's got family trouble. I want to know why my hands are broke. Jack, you're opening a can of worms, Boone warned. You start digging into these men's lives, you're gonna find a lot of misery. Good. Find it. Then bring it to me. 3 days later, Thorne called a meeting. But this wasn't a meeting with his hands, it was a meeting with the investors who held stakes in the cattle drive. The primary stakeholder was Thaddeus Crow, a man with soft hands and a hard heart, who lived in the city and only came to the ranch to complain about margins. They sat in the dining room. Crow, a portly man in a velvet suit, looked annoyed. Thorne, why did you drag us out here in a blizzard? This could have waited until spring. No, it couldn't, Thorne said. He stood at the head of the table. I'm making changes to the payroll. Effective immediately, all wages are increased by 15%. And I'm establishing a relief fund for injuries and family emergencies. Crow laughed. It was a wet, dismissive sound. You've lost your mind. We're running a business, not a charity. You pay these men what the market dictates. If they can't live on it, they should work harder. I have a woman working for me, Thorne said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper. She works 16 hours a day. She doesn't drink, doesn't gamble. And she was living in horse shit because the market decided her life is worth less than a shovel. That ends today. My Lin? Crow scoffed. The Chinese woman? Thorne, be reasonable. They're used to those conditions. It's how they live. You can't bankrupt us to save a stray. Thorne didn't shout. He didn't slam the table. He simply unbuckled the leather strap on his holster. The sound was small, but in the silence of the room, it sounded like a cannon shot. Crow, Thorne said, you seem to forget how I got the money to buy this land. Crow stopped laughing. He swallowed hard, his eyes flicking to the revolver on Thorne's hip. Now, Jack, there's no need for theatrics. I'm buying you out, Thorne said. I'm buying your share, and I'm paying you exactly what you put in 5 years ago. No interest. No profit. You can't do that. We have a contract. I'm altering the deal, Thorne said. You take the check, and you get off my land. Or we can settle this the way we used to settle disputes before contracts were invented. Crow looked at Thorne's eyes. He saw the gunslinger there, the man who had walked through hell and come out carrying the devil's own luck. Crow signed the papers. He left within the hour. The following morning, the snow had stopped. The sky was a piercing, brilliant blue. Thorne stood on the porch of the main house. He had ordered every hand on the ranch to assemble. 40 men stood in the snow, breath steaming, confused and wary. My Lin stood by the kitchen door, Jun and Lian peeking out from behind her apron. They looked clean, warm, and for the first time, hopeful. Listen up. Thorne's voice carried across the yard. I've been running this place on a simple rule, you reap what you sow, hard work gets you paid. Slacking gets you fired. The men nodded. That was the law of the West. I was wrong, Thorne said. The silence was absolute. Jack Thorne never admitted he was wrong. Hard work doesn't mean a damn thing if the ground you're planting in is poisoned, Thorne continued. I found out this week that some of you are choosing between medicine and food. I found out that the people making this ranch run are sleeping in the cold while I sit by a fire. He pointed to the small, unused cottage near the east pasture, the foreman's old house before Boone moved into the bunkhouse to be closer to the men. My Lin, Thorne said. She stepped forward, trembling slightly. That cottage is yours. Rent-free. For as long as you work here. And your debt to the mining company? It's paid. I went to the bank this morning. You start fresh today. Mai Lin covered her mouth with her hands, sobbing openly. The twins hugged her legs. Thorne turned back to the men. As for the rest of you, wages are up 15%. If you've got debts that are choking you, come see me. We'll work it out. I'm not giving you a handout. I'm investing in my property. And you men, you are the ranch. Without you, this is just dirt and snow. The men stood stunned. Then, a slow cheer began to rise. It wasn't raucous, it was a deep, guttural sound of relief and respect. Thorne held up a hand. Get to work. As the men dispersed, moving with a new energy, a lighter step, Thorne watched them go. He felt a tug on his coat. He looked down. It was the boy, June. He held up the wooden dog he had been carving. For you, the boy whispered. To guard the house. Thorne, the man who had shot 6 men in a standoff in Abilene, the man who was known as the Ghost of the Plains, felt his throat tighten. He took the small wooden carving. It was rough, splintery, and imperfect. Thank you, son, Thorne said. I'll keep it on my desk. He looked at Mai Lin, who was wiping her eyes, a smile breaking through the tears. Thorne tipped his hat to her. Breakfast better be good today, Mai Lin. You got a house to keep warm. Yes, Mr. Thorne, she beamed. Best breakfast you ever had. Thorne turned and walked back into his house. He placed the wooden dog on his ledger right next to his bottle of whiskey. He looked out the window at the snow-covered plains. The winter was still brutal, the work was still hard, and the world was still a dangerous place. But as he watched smoke rise from the chimney of the little cottage where a family was finally safe, Jack Thorne realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. And he had finally earned it.